Hello. Technology, it's too hard. Hello. Welcome to Manchester, everybody, virtually. Pity we can't welcome you in person to Manchester, but I hope we will do at some point. Okay, I am now going to share my screen, and so that you can see some pretty pictures at the same time as listening to me. So, Augustus. Well, we're going to start by thinking, come at Augustus through Virgil, the great poet, the greatest Latin poet, the greatest poet of all time. Oh, that's one could contend that. And think a little bit about the relationship between Augustus and Virgil, but not really about their personal relationship, but about how the poem, the great poem, the Aeneid, became Augustus's Aeneid, and how that works. Not why it does, more about how it works. Now, you'll see on this slide, I've given you a quotation from Servius. Servius is a 4th century AD, so 400 years after the time of Virgil and Augustus, a great commentator on the Aeneid, does all sorts of really interesting things and some crazy ones as well. You know, don't just take what Servius says as straightforward truth. Remember that he's 400 years later, you know, almost as long as Shakespeare to us. So, you know, he's not a contemporary witness. But he says this, he says, Virgil's intention is this: to imitate Homer and to praise Augustus through his ancestors. There may be all sorts of complexities about what that means, but it's actually a very clever, brief, extremely brief account of what the Aeneid, Virgil's great poem, is doing. It is imitating Homer, absolutely central to be doing that in order to be an epic poem, and it is, in some sense, praising Augustus through his ancestors. And it was through this process of praising through his ancestors, and we'll look in a moment in more detail about what that means, that much closer to Augustus, well, within Augustus's own day, the poet Ovid could describe the Aeneid as your Aeneid, Augustus. Now, this is, Virgil died in 19 BC, and Ovid is writing in the 2nd decade AD, so sometime before the death of Augustus, but only just before. And he says, that lucky writer of your Aeneid, Augustus. Now, of course, it's not Augustus's Aeneid, it's Virgil's Aeneid. What did he mean? In some sense, the poem is so closely associated with Augustus that, for Ovid's own purposes, admittedly, he can say, your Aeneid. So, how did this work? How is it that the Aeneid is Augustus's poem, despite the fact that it's not about Augustus? It's absolutely not about Augustus, not in any sort of straightforward way is it about Augustus. Rather, it's about Aeneas, funnily enough, and the hero who left Troy when it was overtaken by the Greeks and came to Italy to found a new city. How does it make that into your Aeneid? Well, that's what we're going to look at. It's an old myth, this story of Aeneas leaving Troy when it's destroyed in the Trojan War and coming to Italy. It's around there. In Italy, the story is around as early as the 6th century BC. There's an example I've given you here on this slide. I hope you can see what it is. It's a 4th century BC terracotta from Veii And this is Aeneas carrying Anchises. You can see Anchises kind of strangling Aeneas, who appears to have extremely large ears there. I don't think that can be the case, but anyway, it's an example of a work that shows that the story of Aeneas leaving Troy, taking his father, and so on, it's old, it's already there. Aeneas, the story of Aeneas in Italy, with various, is much older than Virgil. It is quite possible that it's not absolutely certain, but it's quite possible that it featured in Roman historical epic. And it's important to be aware that when Virgil came to write what is ultimately mythological epic about the world of basically the Trojan world, he was writing in a tradition where the great epics that existed previous to him were historical ones. The poet Naevius wrote an epic on the Punic Wars, obviously historical, and Ennius's Annals are, as the name suggests, an epic poem on the history of Rome. So those are directly historical epics, and it is quite possible that they do also include reference, though it would be out of time reference to them, to the Aeneas story. As if you've read the very opening of Livy's history, which is obviously closely contemporary with Virgil, you find the story of Aeneas there. It's a different version of it. In a number of ways, it's a different version, but it is an existing story that's there. Now, this very fact that it's an existing story matters rather a lot for some of the stuff that I'm going to say in a moment. But just let's notice that it's an existing story. It's probably already in the epic tradition, as well as being already certainly in the wider mythology of Rome, that this exists. Okay, you've got an old story. How do you turn it? This is more difficult, into a new statement. How do you turn it into an epic and still be a great epic? As I've said, the existence of historical epic is a feature of Roman literature at this time already. But how does it come about that we get this, that we produce an epic? How do we make it be about Augustus if you're going to write a story that's actually about the deep past? It's not about Augustus. It's a foundation story. Now, the very fact of using foundation stories is very much a feature of Roman thought. We've got this word aitia, you can see I put there. We get the English etiological from that. It means origins stories. The stories of origins are very much a feature of Roman culture in all kinds of ways. And another very important feature of Roman culture is mos maiorum, the ways of our ancestors. So it's linking the past to the present. And these are ways that they're features of Roman culture that Virgil is drawing on in order to make a story of origins be a story about the present day. Another important element in this, and this is a major aspect of the way that Augustan propaganda works very effectively in the poetry and of his day, and of course poetry is absolutely central cultural phenomenon at this period, is this link between Rome and Augustus. This is a brilliant piece of propaganda on Augustus' part, if you like, which is to draw Romanness into himself and to make anything that's about Rome somehow be also about Augustus. And now he does this in all kinds of ways, including the idea of being a sort of refounder of the city. There are stories that about that he considered, or to some extent used, an association with Romulus, but finally didn't push that one. But I mean, partly because of the association of Romulus with civil war, with the killing of brothers. Of course, it's a very big problem for Augustus, is getting over this this issue of civil war. Instead, it pushes it further back into the deep origins, the really historical, not historical, mythical origins of Rome, through the story of Aeneas, and making that the founder. But how does this work? Augustus doesn't occur very often in the poem, and I want to suggest to you that there are 4 ways that this works. They're overlapping ways, but that broadly 4 ways that this works: by ancestry, by analogy, by prophecy, and by teleology, the teleology of time. And I will attempt to explain each of those in a little bit more detail. But for me, I ask you to remember, I can't resist saying that while I am talking here about the Aeneid as broadly a work about Augustus and a work of Augustan propaganda, which is something that has to be said and that has to be acknowledged, I want you to remember that there are many further voices in the Aeneid, and there are many different voices. There are that show a different side to the world. I'm going to resist the temptation to say anything more about that now, because there isn't time, and that's not what we're thinking about. We're thinking about how to write an epic on Augustus without actually writing a story about Augustus. Okay, let's have a look at how this works. Ancestry, first of all, to praise Augustus through his ancestors. The story is that Julius Caesar, the inverted commas father, the adopted father of Octavian, who became Augustus, is descended from Iulus, the son of Aeneas. And therefore, Aeneas is the ancestor of Augustus. Indeed, Venus, the mother of Aeneas, is therefore the ancestor of Augustus. The ancestor of the Romans as a whole, but of Augustus in particular, through this direct descent. Yeah, right. But, through this direct descent from Iulus, the son of Aeneas. Now, this idea, tracing your ancestry back to the Trojans, there's a bit of a craze for it, even of finding Trojan ancestry. And there's a little passage in Book 5 of the Aeneid where various Roman families are mentioned as having been descended from certain of the Trojan followers of Aeneas. It's a widely known phenomenon, isn't it? That somehow, as if tracing your ancestry back to a mythical founder gave you a justification for your ownership of the land now. And that's a very common feature in all kinds of stories of origins and self-justifications of peoples. But it's very strong for the Romans because because they have this very, very strong sense of the ways of our ancestors, of the exemplarity of the past, that someone being an exemplum of the past who is replayed in the present is a very strong, very positive value for them. There's a self-justification. So we've got this suggestion that it is the ancestor of, that Aeneas is the ancestor of Augustus, and as the ancestor is closely related to him. He's not just, that's not just a kind of neutral idea that he's the ancestor. There's a couple of examples here that I'm showing you, and it's worth noting, you see I have written Jupiter and Anchises. Those are the speakers of these two speeches, these two lines, which refer to the ancestry of Augustus in Virgil, in Aeneas. It's worth noting that they both occur in one of the planes of the poem that is outside the real world. Jupiter, in the first one, in Aeneid 1, is in on Olympus, if you like, talking to Venus, who has been complaining about the fact that Aeneas has been shipwrecked. So that's in the divine world. In the other one, in Aeneid 6, this is when Aeneas has gone down to the underworld, and so you've really entered into a different world, in a different plane of reality from the norm, and he's meeting his dead father, Anchises, in the underworld, and Anchises offers him a kind of vision of the future. So that again is it's a way of putting these things outside the kind of the ordinary plane of narrative existence of the story, by putting them into these kind of supernatural places. Now, in the first example, in Aeneid 1, as I say, this is Jupiter speaking, and he says, "But now the boy Ascanius, surnamed Iulus now, he was Ilus, while the Ilian kingdom was a reality." Now, Ilium is another name for Troy, and so we move from Ilium to the name Ilus to the name Iulus, and Iulus then becomes the ancestor of Julius. So he will rule Alba Longa. From there, kings of Hector's race, so Trojans, will reign for 300 years until Ilia, again repeating Ilium of Troy, will bear Mars twins. This is Romulus and Remus. And then we have the foundation of Rome. And then from this glorious source, a Trojan Caesar will be born, who will bound the empire with ocean, his fame with the stars. Now, here I have to pause. The translation I usually use for teaching the Aeneid, my copy is in my office and I can't get at it. So I lifted a translation from Tony Klein's version on which is Poetry and Translation, which is very good. It's got lots of good things, but he oversimplifies here. He said that where I put square brackets, Augustus, comma A, square bracket, he doesn't have the brackets there. He just says Augustus, Julius, his name descended from the great Iulus. But in fact, this is an ambiguity in the poem, which, scholars argue over. Which Julius are we talking about here? Is Jupiter talking about Julius, the one we call Julius Caesar? And you'll see this coin that I've put on the picture here, which is a coin of Julius, and shows you the story of Aeneas carrying his father. So it's obviously making that link with the Aeneas origin for the Julian family. It's not clear whether Jupiter here is talking about Augustus or about Julius. And I'm sure that's deliberate on Virgil's part. It's in the kind of prophetic way of writing, which is this kind of the prophetic way of speaking, which is often a bit ambiguous, a bit unclear as to what it means. Okay, but ultimately it doesn't matter, because this is the point, that it's all about this line of ancestry, and whether it's actually Julius or actually Augustus that's being talked about here doesn't matter for the way that this ancestry idea is working. Okay, and then, but when Anchises does his speech under the in the underworld and promises the descendant of Aeneas, Augustus Caesar, this clearly now is Augustus. In fact, it is the one really clear reference to Augustus in the poem, because there's very little that explicitly refers to Augustus. Right, we better move on, because both those were prophecies. Both ancestry passages were also prophecies. Indeed, that's really kind of the only way you can talk about the ancestry of Augustus, is by prophecy from that world. But there's this one very particular, there are many scenes of prophecy, but there's one very particular scene in Book 8, which is another one of the few examples, probably maybe even be the only other explicit example of an appearance of Augustus in the poem. This is in Book 8. This is on the shield of Aeneas, and there's a representation of the shield there. The shield of Aeneas, which is given to Aeneas by Venus. She has persuaded her husband Vulcan to create this wonderful divine shield for him, and on it are depicted Roman history, including ultimately Augustus Caesar and the Battle of Actium as its centerpiece. And on the other side stands Antony with barbarous wealth and strange weapons, and his Egyptian consort follows him, the shame. So, it's kind of really good Romans against bad Easterners, which I think you'll hear a little bit more about Cleopatra later on. So, what have we got here? Important to notice that this is another case which is outside the normal narrative line of the poem from the point of view of the human characters involved. Aeneas doesn't understand what he sees here at all. He doesn't know he's seeing Augustus Caesar. He doesn't really, or Agrippa or Antony. These things don't mean anything to him, as we're told at the end that he's unaware of it. It's the later reader who looks at these and sees the future written into the shield. Let me just take a moment very briefly to mention Ursula Le Guin's novel Lavinia. It's really good. I'd strongly recommend that you read it. Lavinia, it's a reimagination, of course, of the Aeneid through the eyes of Lavinia. And when she often looks at the shield, and she's quite drawn to the shield, and as she's looking into it, this is very clever. She sees things that are clearly the later history of war, including World War II and atom bombs and so on. That's a very clever continuation of what Virgil is doing, showing the history of Rome's wars through the shield. Right, I've not lent myself much time for my remaining two, analogy and teleology, but I will just say, fairly briefly, analogy. There is some sense in which the Aeneas character that we see through the whole poem in some way reflects on Augustus by analogy. And now analogy is It's very common in Roman thought. So he's not doing something weird and odd here. So even though he never says, oh, Aeneas is meant to be Augustus, by the way. There's nothing to say that. But it is well perceived that Aeneas is standing as in some way an analogy for Augustus. Therefore, any celebration of Aeneas is also celebration of Augustus. Though it's important to remember that it works the other way too, but I won't get distracted into that. And I just gave you two little examples of how this works here. Aeneas as priest and as builder, both of them indeed, Aeneas and Augustus as priest and as builder. In book 3, you see here this statue of Augustus as high priest with the veil over his head. In book 3, when Aeneas and his men visit Helenus, another Trojan exile who is settled there, who is also a prophet, but here Helenus gives Aeneas advice on the right ritual behavior, and he tells him, when your feet have crossed the sea and you raise your altars, veil your hair, clothed in your purple robes, so that in worshipping the gods, no hostile face may intrude among the sacred flames and disturb the omens. Let your friends adopt this mode of sacrifice and yourself, and let your descendants remain pure in this religion. So Helenus is telling Aeneas how to be ritually right and proper, and he's setting that up as the Roman way, and particularly then, associating that with your descendants, meaning Augustus. Likewise, Aeneas is a builder. Now, Aeneas never gets to build Rome. We don't even see him build Lavinium, but we do see him having various attempts at building a series of foundations that he builds on the way towards building the walls of lofty Rome, which is a quotation from the very opening of the poem, as being the goal of this is building. And Augustus famously boasts of his building program, and the building program and the religious reforms are quite bound up in each other. They're both part of this idea of renewing the city, but doing so in a way that's in continuity with the past. And indeed, those things are thrown back into the past as already existing and just being repeated by Augustus. Finally, just 1 minute, teleology. Teleology means aiming at a telos, which is both an end, a literal end, and also a purpose. It's being directed towards your goal. In that same prophecy, Jupiter says to Venus, empire without end I have given, regarding the Roman people, the Roman descendants of Aeneas. So you've got this kind of series that goes from Aeneas to Proto-Rome to Rome to Augustus, and indeed beyond Augustus to eternal Rome. It's got this enormous sense of a huge chronological sweep in which Augustus is a crucial part. But this teleology, the goal-directedness of the poem, is the reason why the literal ending of the poem is so magnificently troubling, and I couldn't resist ending with the point that the poem ends with Aeneas killing Turnus and failing to spare to war down the proud and spare the conquered, because he fails to spare the conquered. And that's why the literal end is so magnificently troubling. But nonetheless, it all works through this multiplicity of ideas, through the teleology, the sense that this great expanse of time is all encompassed in the connection between Aeneas and Augustus. Okay, and there I shall stop. And I realised that I haven't left myself very long for questions, but I'm very happy, of course, to take any if Nikki will allow things to happen.
Yes, sorry, I just had to find myself. Thank you so much, Alison. That was fantastic. That was really, really interesting. So yes, the chat is open. So please, if you have any questions, I believe you should be able to use the chat function. I think you have permission to do that, and then simply type in your question, and then either write me directly or simply write everyone, and we can see the question. While we wait, can I ask you a question, Alison?
Of course.
One thing that struck me with this Roman, I guess, obsession with being descendants of Troy, how did they square that with the idea that Troy, after all, is on the losing side of the war in some way?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot in Aeneas's own account of how he's leaving Troy. That where he is, it's very much the gods tell him that he must. This is fate. This is what's prophesied. He must take a remnant and build a new society for them. So it's very much that idea that this is God driven, and quite a lot of remarkably many origin stories of certainly Greco-Roman, I don't know about other ancient civilizations, involve some kind of disaster or violence or something in their origin story. Quite a lot are groups of fugitives from some kind of previous thing. But they do also, there's also a strand which suggests there's a strand which suggests that that they're actually coming home, because they're told to seek out your ancient mother, and there's this story that they come originally from Italy anyway, so they're even more justified.
I think we have a question here. It's odd to think that the end of the poem is troubling. Was it to the Romans of the time, or did they expect their conquerors to slaughter the opposition like Carthage?
Well, I mean, this has been argued about just, wonderfully for many years. They, at one level, you could say they expect their conquerors to kill the enemy, but the crucial point, the thing I kind of referred to very, very quickly there, was that when Anchises is speaking in the underworld and telling Romans how to behave through Aeneas, he says, your task, Roman, is to war down the proud and spare the pacere subjectis, to spare those who have been subjected, those who have spare the overcome. Now, Anturnus explicitly says, okay, you've won. Everyone has seen that you've won. Lavinia's your wife. You've won. Do not pursue your anger further. And he does do it. And this has been a problem ever since. As to, so many people over the years have wanted to say, and now this is a critic from about the 1920s or something like that, saying, and now all can turn to face the shining future. There's nothing about turning to face the shining future. In the 14th century, I think, somebody felt the need even to write an extra bit on the end to make it more comfortable, because everyone's uncomfortable with it like this, which is why it's so brilliant.
I think we have just time for a last question.
Yeah.
How much can we see this as state propaganda or simply shaping a better image for a new regime?
Well, what would be the difference between those? I mean, shaping a better image for a new regime is state propaganda. I mean, propaganda isn't always lies. It might just be And, you know, some people even want to say that it's trying to influence that image. Now, but it is very important that what we're seeing there, it is only one side to it. There are many other sides, you know, about the old idea of the two voices of the Aeneid, the public voice and the private voice. And then people develop that to further voices and the sort of many different voices that there are that really do express some of the anxieties about this, as well as the, you know, as well as the potential glorification. I think you just have to hold them both, I'm afraid, you know, as possibilities. It's also worth, I mean, sometimes people say, oh, but, you know, of course, Virgil died in 19, so he never saw the more tyrannical way that Augustus became later. It's true as well. But then, I mean, read Richard Thomas's 2001, I think it is, book, Virgil and the Augustan Reception. That's just really good way of considering these questions, I think.